should be moving up and down. Is that top bar moving up and down? Okay, there we go. All right, so we kind of last time we left off talking. You kind of talked about Western expansion a little bit, and did you get in? You didn't get into the Enlightenment or anything like that, did you? No. Age of Enlightenment. Okay. Well, we're not going to touch too much on Enlightenment. Actually, we're really not going to touch all other than what this last topic really like hits on, and where it kind of picks up. But what we're talking about today is postmodernism. It's a Western philosophy, a late 20th century movement characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism or relativism, and a general suspicion of reason and an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. So, obviously, right off the rip, you've got skepticism, subjectivism, or relativism, which, when we think of postmodernism, that's most often what we think of, right? We think of relative, no absolute truth, right? That's what we think of when we think of postmodernism as like a broad philosophy. But there's more to it than just that. Like I said, skeptical of everything, and we'll get into kind of the reason why they're skeptical of everything. General suspicion of reason and acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. It wasn't just that truth is relative. That's like the broad generalization of postmodernism, but it was even more so that nothing could really be trusted, even so much. And that's why when somebody, even like socialist ideas, because we'll get into a couple really popular people at the time, even like socialist ideas, they were real skeptical of them because they were skeptical of anything that was trying to harness power or authority. Can you think of like why that might be so? What have we literally spent the last, like pretty much most of our time here talking about? Literally corruption, not just in the church, but just in the colonization of America and what was going on in Europe at the time. Pretty much everything was centered around what? Leveraging or authority, trying to gain enough power that you can have control of people or territories or whatever. This goes all the way back to, right when Christianity was declared Rome's national religion, to the rise of the empirical church, to the rise of the empirical. That's not right. Not empirical. Basically the authoritative church over everything, and then even into the Renaissance era, Western civilization. How much time did Eric and you spend on talking about how Christianity was used to infiltrate Native Americans and new territories, and missionaries were used as decoys basically so that they could take over places. So postmodernism is a real pushback against some of that. So postmodernism emerged from modernism, hence the name postmodernism. It is essential to have an understanding of modernism first. But modernism itself is not just a singular entity. And because of that, postmodernism in and of itself is not just a singular entity, where what you think of when you think of postmodernism isn't the only definition of postmodernism, go figure. And it's because in modernism, there's two categories of modernism that were real prominent at the time. And so because of that, there's two categories of postmodernism that go along with that. The first one is 20th century ascetic modernism, which emerged during the first half of the 20th century as a reaction to the 19th century tradition. So, and I'm pronouncing that right, aesthetic, like what you think of when you think of like, oh, that's very aesthetic or aesthetically pleasing. You know what I mean? That's the word it's talking about. Modernism was a series of aesthetic movements of wild experimentation in visual arts, music, literature, drama, architecture in the first half of the 20th century. It flourished between 1910 and 1930. So it's kind of a real narrow kind of gap of when it was really, really popular. But the period is known as high modernism. Modernism, in this sense, was rooted in changes in Western society at the end of the 19th century and beginning in the 20th century. It was a trend of thought that affirmed the power of human beings to create, improve, reshape their environment with the aid of scientific knowledge, technology, and practical experimentation. So it wasn't so much just basically it involved experimentation, but it revolved basically going against the status quo. So unique architecture, unique, plays, poetry, lots of poetry came out of this time. So it was a very, again, aesthetic. It was like that literal when you think about that. At the time, there were two disruptive thinkers that really rose to power at that time. Can you think of who they are? 1910 and 1930. One of them, sorry, you go. You had something on your.
Here in America, or?
I think no, not just here in America.
Is he an atheist?
Yeah, one of them is.
Okay. I just can't remember his name.
What's he known for?
Atheism.
Well, no, okay, so he's known for something much bigger than that. So he's known for something that's preached in our schools quite a bit and that we talk about. Yes, who is it? Darwin. So Charles Darwin. And then the other one is a very prominent, more socialist leader. Karl Marx. So these two were kind of your main people that rose during this time of postmodern, but in the aesthetic postmodern, or aesthetic modernism. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection undermined religious certainty of the general public and the sense of human uniqueness among the intelligent, or kind of like your intelligent thought leaders of the day. The notion that human beings were driven by the same impulses as lower animals proved to be difficult to reconcile with the idea of ennobling spirituality. Marx seemed to present a political version of the same proposition, that problems with the economic order were not transient, the result of specific wrongdoers or temporary conditions, but were fundamentally contradictions within the capitalist system. Both thinkers would spawn defenders in schools of thought that would become decisive in establishing modernism. So modernism came out of the Age of Enlightenment. So what was really, really popular, which we'll get into very specific things that postmodernism is against, was just this idea that we can know our reality, like we can know what's in front of us. We can actually think about that. We can use logic and reason to come to conclusions. So these ideas of systems, these ideas, again, of something like evolution, started to become really, really popular because of thinkers like these two. So again, modernism, aesthetic modernism. Now, the much longer historical tradition, which historically they call modernity, isn't just the aesthetic modernism, but modernity. So when you hear those two, like if I use the word modernity, I'm talking about the longer period of time where we get more into that logical reason as a result of what happened in the aesthetic modernism, which started the humanistic rationalism of the Enlightenment of the 18th century. Modernism, in the second definition, can be tracked back to the Enlightenment, which is a humanistic reaction in the 18th century to pre-modern medieval type of religious dogma, which could still be found in Lutheran and Calvinist scholasticism, Jesuit scholasticism, and the theory of the divine right of kings in the Church of England in the late 16th and 17th centuries. Basically, religious movements and philosophies and this rise of basically this promotion of human thought and logic, which, again, what can that be traced back to, right? That can be traced all the way back to the Roman Empire, right? All the way back to the Roman Empire where philosophers, this idea that humans can, basically their thought and logic made them above everything else. Like this is where the culmination of that really comes into play. It's like what happened in early Rome carries itself out right here, you know what I mean, during this time period. This modernity tradition of enlightenment stressed the importance of rational human self, objective truth or law, order, progress, etc. And it was behind most of the 19th century traditions, so when the limitations of the 19th century were felt, modernity served as an indirect background against which 20th century aesthetic modernism sprang, When the limitations of modernity were more directly felt later in the 20th century, it issued a reaction called postmodernism. So basically the idea that these people were, which, again, the idea that these people were promoting, because it didn't lead to any more advancement or at least perceived advancement, they were like, no, we don't want nothing to do with that. And again, what you saw was this rise of power, like a guy like Karl Marx, where these people started looking at this going, this isn't progressing society, this isn't good, this isn't what we need. And so postmodernism was kind of a backlash against these two ideas because people just didn't feel, almost not, the right word wouldn't be fulfilled, but they didn't feel like it did anything for society to hold these things in the highest of esteems, if that makes sense. So, postmodernism, obviously, there's two camps. The first one we talked about is a pushback against the aesthetic modernism. And I have like basically reaction A and reaction B to that, and then we get into kind of what happens as a result of that. So, reaction A, postmodernism as a reaction to 20th century aesthetic modernism emerged after World War II specifically. It still carried most of the features of the 20th century aesthetic modernism, so some have argued that it is essentially just an outgrowth of modernism. Basically, it was, here's modernism. This was just supposedly like the next evolutionary step of modernism was, this is the aesthetic postmodernism, the reaction to that. And not a separate movement. But there is a fundamental difference. It is that while aesthetic modernism had presented fragmentation, for example, as something tragic to be lamented, postmodernism no longer laments it, but rather celebrates it. Meaning, when something goes bad, we're not going to be sad about that. That happened for a reason. So when something rises and falls, we're not worried about that. Thus, postmodernism is inclined to stay with meaningless, playing with nonsense. So, meaninglessness and playing with nonsense. And actually, what I read about this time period in particular is a lot of the dominant thought leaders of that time were like suicidal and depressed because there was no real meaning to life, because stuff just rose and fall, and that was kind of the end of it. You know what I mean? There was no hope. There was no, if we're not holding logic, if we're not holding arts, if we're not progressing these things, we don't care about those things, then what's the point of living? So, some people killed themselves. We're talking some of these main thought leaders killed themselves because, well, what, you know what I mean? There was nothing really to live for. Up until the 1970s, the discussion of postmodernism was generally confined to postmodernism in the first sense. What I just talked about, this idea that they were inclined to stay with meaninglessness and playing with nonsense. Basically, there was no real end to anything, so why do we care about it? Logic and reason were out the door. Who cares about that kind of stuff? But in 1980, however, a guy with the last name Habermas, he had a lecture on, and it was literally entitled Modernity, the Unfinished Project. And it was just this idea that what we've seen in modernism hasn't come to an end yet. And so we need to finish what we started with modernism. We need to continue to pursue logic. We need to continue to pursue this. But here's what happened. This helped bring a shift to the discussion of postmodernism in the first sense to postmodernism in the second sense, which postmodernity, we'll talk about that. Ironically, because of his strong defense of modernity and against postmodernism, right? All he did was breed more, the end, basically what we have today, the idea that there is no absolute truth. We're suspicious of anything that is like a mainstream ideology. We'll get into some of the other beliefs, but basically you can trace it back to the 1980s. In 1980, when this guy wrote this article, modernism just started to flourish. It went from being kind of a small movement to people were like, no, we're defending this. But when Habermas was trying to defend modernity as an unfinished project, we should not abandon it. It prompted those who were in favor of post-modernity to react. Since then, a large volume of literature has continued to snowball, focusing on post-modernity, as the more important facet of postmodernism. So we're not worried about the first part, where we stay with meaninglessness, we stay with nonsense, but we basically push back against all of these objective realities, and we try to, let your truth be your truth, and what words might be here might not be the same over here, go down the list. What should be added to the list as an important aspect of postmodernism is something called the Project of Deconstruction. Now, what do we think about when we think about deconstruction today? People believe in the faith, but that's not what this is talking about. I thought the same thing. Because you were like, I thought the same thing when I first read that. I was like, oh, here we go. Like, this is going to be gold. But that's not what it's talking about. It's talking about, basically, so the person, Jacques Derrida, I don't know how to say it, Derrida, Derrida. Derrida's argument is the deconstruction proves that texts have multiple meanings. So their person's point was that violence between the different meanings of the text may be elicited by close textual analysis. But basically what the whole thing of deconstruction was is that words don't, so author's intended meaning, when we're talking about interpretation, right? That's bullcrap. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. But that's, we shouldn't be worried about that. The words are written, they have their own meaning, and what they mean today might be different from what they meant back then. And that's okay. Yeah, so or like how you read it and how you read it might be differently, and neither of you are wrong. You know what I mean? So that's was a main kind of facet of postmodernism in the 80s when this person wrote this article. And again, there's all kinds of literature coming out. But here's my thing. Why wouldn't there be? Anybody can write on this topic, because who's to tell you you're not being true or not? You know what I'm saying? So it just makes sense that this was kind of the end result of this. However, it's safe to say that the two different senses of postmodernism cohere are not separate, even though they are originally two different reactions to two different facets of modernism, respectively. Time-wise, they both started soon after World War II. In terms of content as well, they concur in many respects. They interact, and the postmodern they interact, and the postmodern turn can result from the interaction between the two, and what this is called in I guess your different articles that were written about this is the postmodern pie. Basically, both of these things come from the same pie, even though that they're different. Okay, so the interaction of the two has resulted in the convergence of them also. Today, as some of the general characteristics of postmodernism as a whole, the following points is more popular in terms of mention. So these 5 things are kind of 5 points that I guess could identify postmodernism. We'll talk about this a little bit. First one is no absolute truth. Shocker there, right? Now, here's another one. No absolute ethical standard. Hence the cause of feminists and homosexuals should be tolerated. And not just historical feminism, but obviously modern feminism, which is very different than historical feminism. No absolute religion. This means to promote religious inclusivism. It also leans towards the New Age religion. So kind of more, that again, that's that humanistic spiritualism, which we kind of see as pretty popular today, right? Globalization. So there is no absolute nation. National boundaries hinder human communication. So the idea that, nations have borders, all of this, in their minds, is a fight against pushing civilization forward, because it divides people, in their opinion.
Yeah, the thing to me about all this is you're saying there is no standard, everybody's truth their own, but yet don't feel that way, because that's not right.
Yep. And honestly,
It's just such a complex
it is. Well, and the truth is, anybody that you read that talks about this, they point that out, that the biggest problem with postmodernism, hold on, there's one more thing. Pro-environmentalism, Western society is blamed for the destruction of the environment. That's the last one. But everybody that talks about postmodernism, in like, I guess talks about the critiques of it, points that out, right? One of my buddies, actually, you know, Brandon Pierce. So my buddy Brandon Pierce, in college, because I remember this. Here's the thing with postmodernism that's crazy, is when I was in college, I remember talking about this. This was back in like 2006, 2007, 2008, you know, time frame. And I remember being in an apologetics class and them talking about postmodernism. And I remember like legitimately thinking to myself, are there people that really believe this? You know what I mean? Like I legit thought that, like, man, most people don't believe this. That's what I thought, you know, most people don't believe this. My buddy Brandon was at Starbucks, like, I don't know, sometime that year. I don't remember when. And he told me the story when he got back. He's like, hey, I got to tell you about this thing. And he's like, I was at Starbucks, and I'm listening to these two, when we're in Joplin, there's a little Division II school called Missouri Southern State University right there. And he said, I was listening to these two philosophy majors from Missouri Southern State University, you know, talking about philosophy, you know. And they're sitting there talking, and he said, I hear them, and they're talking about, like, postmodernism. They're talking about how there's no such thing as absolutes. And they're, like, going back and forth about this, and da-da-da-da. And Brandon said, I turned around to him, and I said, so you're saying that there's no such thing as absolutes? And he goes, yes. And he's like, are you sure about that? And he's like, yes. He's like, that's an absolute. And the guy's like, no, man, you don't get it. It's like, you don't get it. And he's like, no, man, like, I get it, but what you're saying doesn't make any sense. But that is kind of one of the biggest hindrances to this. So, I also here have, I think it's like 7 or 8 points. Yes, 7 or 8 points here about how kind of what they were pushing back against. It kind of goes into a little bit more detail about what they were pushing back against modernism specifically about. But it like gives you a little bit better taste on what, between what I just read, those 5 kind of points, and what kind of this unpacks. It gives you a little bit more of a better framework for what postmodernism even is. It honestly makes so much more sense that we kind of are where we are today when you start listening to some of this stuff and you read it. You're like, we're here because we're still in like this evolved state of postmodernism. You know what I mean? Because some articles tried to act like postmodernism isn't a thing anymore. And I'm like, have you been paying attention to anything? Because it's very much still a thing. Okay, so the first one, there is an objective. So the first, and when I read these are points that they would be against. So they would hear this and go, no. The first one is, there is an objective natural reality, a reality whose existence and properties are logically independent of human beings, of their minds, their societies, their social practices, and their investigative techniques. They would disagree with that. Postmodernism dismissed this idea as a kind of naive realism. Such reality as there is, according to postmodernism, is conceptual construct, an artifact of scientific practice and language. So, what does that sound like? Are we all just in the matrix? You know what I mean? Like that's kind of what it's like. There is no natural reality. Like you can't. Again. Yeah, there's nothing. None of these things are independent of human beings. Like because we think these things, that's why they are the way they are. You know what I mean? The descriptive and explanatory statements of scientists and historians can, in principle, be objectively true or false. They would disagree with that statement because there's no such thing as absolute truth. So, a scientist could say something, and what does that matter to them? So, what is a modern example of this, of an inconsistency? If you were to follow science to a reason, let's just talk about evolution. Something that our society is all for, but scientifically doesn't make any sense. They shouldn't be all for it. Well, gender would be one of them, okay? But let's go like the earliest parts of that. Where did that come out of? What was the first thing, biggest thing? Gen Z, big marker, legalized not that long ago. Same-sex relationships, right? Scientifically, when you're talking about the theory of evolution, which is pretty widely accepted as a scientific form of reason, right? What is one of the main tenets of evolution? Procreation, yeah, right? Furthering species, right? Evolution cannot take place if species are not furthered. So, is same-sex relationships a furthering of the species? Is it something that should be held in high esteem? Is it something that we should say, yeah, that's perfectly natural, it's good, we should be all about that? According to, if we're talking about, not even from a biblical worldview, talking about from a scientific worldview. No, absolutely not. I've thought this for years and I couldn't figure it out. And then I read this and I'm like, well, duh, Matt, why didn't you think about that? It's because postmodernism, this idea of non-absolute truth, has affected everything, even science, which most people would say, this is how we know what's true or not true, science, right? But they don't even believe that. Because if they did, this would be something that they'd be like, yeah, you can do that, but you shouldn't. You know what I mean? And that's not even from a Christian worldview. I remember I had this, we had to argue, and I remember arguing from a philosophical standpoint. I was in a philosophy class in college, and I had to promote like same-sex relationships, because basically you were supposed to philosophically like argue for things that you wouldn't argue for, and like learn how to do that, you know. And so I'd argue for like, yeah, I'm okay with same-sex relationships, and so I'd argue with two other kids in the class about this whole thing. And they had no idea what to do with my position, because I just said, yeah, I don't think that it's right, but I don't have a problem with people doing it, and here's why. And I basically argued like, you know, you shouldn't do it. You shouldn't do it because of these reasons, but if people want to do it, then that's their own thing, and it's whatever. And I just talked about this idea of science and upholding that. And they didn't know what to do with that, because they were like, wait a minute, so you're not for it, but you're fine with people doing what the heck they want to do? Like, because the truth is, again, going by a humanistic worldview, if that person goes and does that, well then, you know, what's their end? You know what I mean? They're not going to survive. Their species or their family unit's not going to be carried on, and that's not something I have to worry about. You know what I mean? So, but that's basically, there's no absolute truth. So it doesn't matter what scientists or historians say, because we don't trust what they say anyways. 3, through the use of reason and logic, and with key, more specialized tools provided by science and technology, human beings are likely to change themselves and their societies for the better. They would disagree with that statement. These things aren't going to progress things forward. Postmodernists deny the Enlightenment faith in science and technology as instruments of human progress. Led to the development of the technology, because in their minds, think about what this just came out of. What did postmodernism come afterwards? What was before it? It came out of one big event. World War II, right? World War II. So when they look at science and technology, what are they seeing? Soldiers coming back in coffins. They're seeing, you know, people who get caught in the crossfire, you know, innocent people dying. They're seeing what happened politically with World War I was Japan, right? Or was that Germany? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so yeah. So basically they're seeing all of these things take place, and they're like, no, science is not, technology is not a good thing. Look at what it's done. Science, technology, and even reason and logic are inherently destructive and oppressive. Listen to this. Science and technology and even reason and logic are inherently destructive and oppressive, because they have been used by evil people, especially during the 20th century, to destroy and oppress others. Think about what we have going on today and where it's coming from. Oppressive systems, oppressive technologies, oppressive reason and logic, right? You wonder why we have some of these conversations and people are like, you're like, man, this doesn't make sense. Why would someone believe this? Because they're never going to believe it. You know what I mean? They think that these things are oppressive and destructive.
And that comes from, in essence, from Marx, right?
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, it comes from, again, this is, the funny thing about all of this is it came from somewhere, but I remember a guy said once, he said, don't focus so much on not being like someone, because you'll become exactly like them. And I think that's what ends up happening so often. I did a lesson on justice and God to my students, and one person that I was listening to said that more often than not, when somebody that is oppressed rises to power, they become oppressors. Almost all the time.
It's like I just listened the other day to a podcast on the difference between equity and equality and how the world was getting those terms mixed up.
Mm-hmm.
And they cited it was in Zimbabwe
Mm-hmm.
where there was these farmers, these like white farmers there that cultivating his land, doing all this stuff, and the locals
Yep.
like rose up and totally overtook them, ran them out. I don't know if they killed them, whatever. So
I think I heard this lecture too.
they didn't know how to farm.
So they made the white people.
I don't know, something happened, but it went from being like the richest.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
To being the most impoverished, and they still haven't recovered because it was that kind of social
Okay.
like takeover.
See, I've heard where they made like that someone took over a place and then made them farm in response. So it was like they were oppressed and then they became the oppressor. But that makes sense though, because yeah, I think I've heard that one too. I might have just got two stories mixed up, but again, these things cannot be trusted because all they lead to is oppression and destructiveness. Reason and logic are universally valid. Reason and logic are merely conceptual constructs and are therefore valid only within the established intellectual traditions in which they are used. So basically, what happens here and how you use intellectual stuff here, that might not be true over there, even though you might be talking about something like gravity. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Like, so again, you laugh, but this is.
This is what I don't understand because you're talking about.
I'm missing.
Surprising
Oh, no, right here.
The backlash against science, right?
Yep.
Science is oppressive and stuff. And I'm not trying to otherize people. I'm not trying to lump everybody in the same group, but it seems like the most loud, vocal part of our society is kind of in that postmodern thought, where when it comes to LGBT stuff, not going to trust it. Abortion, not going to trust it. But yet, when it comes to putting a mask on your face and vaccinated because science says,
Yep.
oh, now we're going to,
Yep.
you know, and try to get everybody to follow. You know what I'm saying? Like,
No.
there's no consistency there.
Yep. But how can there be consistency when your main tenet is, well, yeah.
Surprising that they would
Yep.
do that against science.
Well, see, and I'll say this, postmodernism in its inception and even in its early stages, obviously, this is why I was saying at the beginning, what we see today, you cannot disconnect it from what we're talking about here. It's just evolved. You know what I mean? Just like what people would say about the 20th century ascetic modernism versus 20th century ascetic postmodernism. You know what I mean? Where they were like, no, this is just like a carry-out process of this. It's not really that much different. So, and that's where I would say what you're saying is probably exactly it. You know, it's like there's been more of an embracement of basically what's happened is, and I think, again, this is what like for instance, the examples that you're using. What is one of their main things, their main goals that we talked about, right? This idea of globalization and pro-environmentalism, this idea that they wanted human unity. Again, what they looked at is that science and these things are systems of oppression, but with like the mask thing, how was that? And I want to make sure everyone online, if someone's watching this, is clear. I don't have a problem with masks. I honestly see the reason to not wear one. Same thing with vaccinations. If someone wants to do that, that's fine. If someone doesn't want to do that, that's fine. But with the mask thing, exactly, with the mask thing and with the vaccination, how was it sold? We're all in this together. Yep. Exactly. So, yes, and it's still like that. It's still like that, right? I mean, that's how they're still talking about it. Even though there's conflicting evidence. This is the thing, and this is going back to talking about postmodernism. If there's no objective truth, and if science and reason and logic can't be fully trusted, you end up with a society that you can get online and find peer-reviewed articles to support any position that you want. You see, like this, where we are at right now is directly connected to this, right? Where absolute truth doesn't matter. Reason and logic don't matter. If you want to believe that, you can believe that. Doesn't mean I have to like it. You know what I mean? So it's wild. It's just wild. Okay, so there are such things as human nature. It consists of faculties, aptitudes, or dispositions that are in some sense present in human beings at birth rather than learned or instilled through social forces. Basically, that people have certain inclinations, they have certain aptitudes, certain things, that dispositions that they're supposed to go towards. They would disagree with that. Postmoderns insist that all, or nearly all, aspects of human psychology are completely socially determined. Right? Think about a big topic today, you brought it up earlier, that this is the exact argument that is used. Socially determined. It's not real. What is it? Gender identity. There's only two genders. I literally have had students in my youth group say, "Oh yeah, there's more than two genders. The two genders things, that's just a social construct." This is exactly what this is born out of. So what we're seeing today is a direct result of what happened in 1980. Okay, language refers to and represents a reality outside of itself. Postmodernists claim that language is semantically self-contained or self-referential. The meaning of a word is not a static thing in a world or even an idea in the mind, but rather a range of contrasts and differences with the meanings of other words. Human beings can acquire knowledge about natural reality, and the knowledge can be justified ultimately on the basis of evidence or principles that are or can be known immediately, intuitively, or otherwise with certainty. Basically, it's what we've been saying this whole time, right? There's no objective reality, no absolute truth, 8, it is impossible, or at least in principle, to construct general theories that explain many aspects of natural or social world within a given domain of knowledge. Postmodernists dismiss this notion as a pipe dream and indeed as symptomatic of an unhealthy tendency within the Enlightenment discourses to adopt, again, going back to what we talked about before, totalitizing systems of thought or grand meta-narratives of human biology, biological, historical, or social development. Basically, right, that all you're trying to do by figuring all of this out, right, that figuring out the social world and all of that, is you're just trying to fit people into your little box, and that's not how it works, and blah, blah, blah. You know what I'm saying? That's what they're getting at there. So, all you're trying to do is hold people down. You know what I mean? All you're trying to do is oppress people and have control and authority. Okay, here's another thing, another interesting thing. I read this, I had to make sure I put this in here. It should be noted, however, that some postmodernists, and actually a lot of them, vehemently reject the relativist label. It's kind of weird because you're like, no absolute truth. Postmodernists deny that there are aspects of reality that are objective, that there are statements about reality that are objectively true or false. That it is possible to have knowledge of such statements, objective knowledge, that it is possible for human beings to know some things with certainty, and that there are objective or absolute moral values. Reality, knowledge, and values are constructed by discourses, hence they can vary within them. This means that the discourse of modern science, when considered apart from the evidential standards internal to it, has no greater purchase on the truth than do alternative perspectives, including, for example, astrology and witchcraft. Postmodernists sometimes characterize the evidential standards of science, including the use of reason and logic, as enlightenment rationality. So when they look at these things, they would say, we're not completely relativists. We're saying what is true here, and what is true here is true here. So in their minds, they're like, we're not complete relativists because we do believe that there is truth. We just don't believe that what's true here is true over here. I'm like, you're just playing semantical gymnastics at this point instead of just saying what you mean and meaning what you say. You know what I mean? Okay, I wanted to make sure I included this. So I read like a 20-page published article This guy references D.A. Carson and all kinds of things. We're not going to read all 20 pages. We're just going to read his conclusion because I think it's interesting how he kind of wraps this up. He says this: in conclusion to the above discussion, the implications of postmodernism on Christian apologetic are now considered. It is obvious by now that postmodernism is an extremely relativistic and skeptical view of the world. Of the ideas of postmodernism that have been examined, postmodernism's skepticism is perhaps most evident in the denial of objective reality, objective truth, the universality of logic and reason, and its assertion of instability and unreliability of language. If logically reasoned arguments are ineffectual and appeals to foundational truths are incredulous to the postmodern mind, a significant hurdle is set before the cause of a Christian apologetics. Right? The idea that if there's no objective truth or objective reality and language doesn't mean one thing here and reason doesn't mean one thing here, how do you minister to these people? He says this, though: however, there is a reason to believe that reaching postmodern man with the Christian message might not be as difficult as first thought. The reason is inconsistency. Despite the reputation of reason and objective reality, people tend to not live according to these premises. They tend to not live according to these premises. Most people believe reality is objective enough to stop them from deciding to drive their cars on the wrong side of the road. For instance, similarly, it is assumed that justice system, that most people have a good enough grasp of what is true to allow them to give a testimony in court. Right? Think about if you took postmodernism to its end result, what could you do? What could you not do? You know what I mean? Like he brings up a very good point there. How could somebody give a statement about what somebody did if you're skeptical of all objective reality, if there is no such thing as true, if what he's saying could be interpreted by someone else as different? You know what I mean? You'd have 12 people on a jury, and all of them could be hearing him say something completely different. You know what I'm saying? Even though he's saying, this is what happened. This person shot this person. Well, did he really shoot that person? Did he use a gun? Like, you know what I mean? Like, everything would be in question. But that's not how our justice system works. The computer software designer through postmodernism still must use logic to do his job properly. This inconsistency in postmodernism behavior demonstrates that it might be premature to abandon the use of reasoned argument in Christian apologetics. There's a guy that I want to reference, but it's hard to say his name with what he recently did, because I think he's good at what this guy's getting ready to talk about, or was good. This inconsistency in postmodern behavior, Christian apology. The image of God in man is expressed in man's rationality, and it is difficult to see how this could be fully erased. Basically, within humanity, within this imago Dei, is this ability to reason and have rationality. And what this guy's saying is, how could you completely get rid of that? You know what I mean? It may seem that way, but you got to have some hope that it's still in there. Postmodern relativism is especially seen in its ethics and morality, yet the same could be said for modernism. And while there is the thought amongst postmodernists that at a deeper level all religions are the same, this too was a feature of old modernism. However, the tolerance of postmodernism has potential to make people more open to Christian friendship and hospitality. Generally, postmoderns will likely value personal relationships over truth. I read a book recently that was talking about Gen Z in particular, and why it's important to create like a culture within your kids of like following Jesus is cool, and like, that they have support, and is because if you have a kid come in and he goes to school and his 10 other friends don't follow Jesus, then the likelihood of him not following Jesus is pretty high, because he's going to get with his friends and he's going to value those personal relationships. And if his credibility starts being questioned there, then the chances of him leaving that are very high. You know what I mean? Which we could get into theologically speaking what that means, but generally postmoderns will likely value personal. Since they perceive meta-narratives and knowledge to be about the pursuit of power, presentations of the gospel to postmoderns should be persuasive, not coercive. So what I would think is like the idea, the old, here are your 4 options, right? Like, you You die with God. If you die and God's not real, then you lived a good life. If you die and God is real, then you go to heaven and you follow him. If you die and you don't follow God and he's not real, well, you know what I'm saying? Go down the list, like the four. Then some people might view that as coercive instead of just trying to persuade them one direction. You know what I mean? What? Exactly, but people will use that sometimes. And I've had that discussion with certain people, but it's in a very specific context. You know what I mean? But you've talked about this before when you used to be trained in evangelism. How was that? You used to talk about how it was like door-to-door evangelism.
It was very manufactured, and I mean, you left them with answering a question that was obvious.
Yeah.
It was just obvious. It was just a salesman's tactic.
Yeah.
Man,
That's what you talk about, is a salesman's tactic. Yeah. Yep. And that's what it's saying, like, don't do that.
Question, where would you go if you died tonight?
Yeah. No, I think that question can be helpful. You had a kid. Yeah. Yes, you can use that, but it's one of those things where it's saying, like, in a personal conversation, that might not be the best tactic to deal with a postmodernist, because some of them, if they are thinkers, might view that as coercive as opposed to, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. But I think it's reading the room. You know what I mean? Being smart about that kind of stuff. Perhaps because postmodernists like narratives, perhaps preachers could draw more narrative passage rather than discourses in their teaching. Now, again, I don't think this guy's saying don't do, like, avoid discourses. I think he's saying, like, don't shy away from the parables. You know what I'm saying? Don't shy away from the stories, because those are what people are going to connect with. Happily, the Bible has no want for engaging stories which also teach vital theological lessons. At some stage, postmodernism should be challenged on meta-narratives, yet it must be borne in the mind that many believers understand little of the comprehensiveness of God's eternal plan for salvation, yet have credible profession of faith and are doubtlessly Christians. I think that last line is really important, that when somebody looks at the life of a believer, there should be no doubt that that's what they're doing. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's one of those things that stood out to me the most was that last line right there. And it's not the last line, there's another paragraph I'm going to read, but that idea that one of the worst things in a postmodern era is to have people saying they're Christians and then not being Christians. So, lastly, the Christian may well agree that with postmodernists that modernism has not served man's spiritual and personal needs well. However, postmodernism has its own set of problems and these are not minor. Take away language, morality, logic, knowledge, reason, and man is left with only solipsism, which is basically like self-absorption, entire self-absorption, and crushing loneliness. He is left to his own mind only. Because if what's true for you is not true for you, and what's true for him is not true for that person, and what's true for that person is not true for you, how can you have any kind of relationship that's built on anything real? You can't. So think about this. Rise of suicide, rise of depression, rise of technology, rise of isolation, rise of, you know what I mean? It's incredibly enlightening when you think about this stuff and you're like, we're still in a postmodern era.
This stuff is so needed with younger generation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that looks like.
Yep.
Other than the person being intentional in their own environment.
I was gonna say, let's talk about that. What do we do about this?
I've had multiple times when I'm talking to youth and stuff and sharing where I've asked the question, is truth objective or subjective?
Uh-huh.
I see the wheels turn a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was teaching in Junction, I asked all four of my classes, and the majority of them said objective. There's some that didn't. But I think kids aren't a lot of times given that space to even think through those things.
Mm-hmm.
Like to even be confronted with, all right, let's lay this out.
Yep.
What's being taught, what's being
Yeah.
think when they have that freedom of space, you can kind of see the errors in there.
But what's hard is, think about if you were talking to high school students. If they haven't had space to think by that point, how do they think? You know what I mean? That's what's hard. It's like, but you got to have this hope, though, that, and I think this is what I liked. I wanted to finish with what this guy kind of talked about, is that what you just talked about is the inconsistency of postmodernism, of the way that a lot of our world thinks right now. People that sit in here, the way that they think right now, the inconsistencies of that is how you reach them. You know what I mean?
Do you get much into like presuppositional apologetics?
I did when I was in college. I haven't done a lot with it recently.
And if that boomed as a response to postmodernism, or if that,
Well, yeah. I think so again, if you want to talk about, yes, I think that, along with a lot of what you see more biblically focused churches trying to do today, I think it all is in response to postmodernism, to what they see in culture. Now, I think most churches that have a semi-decent thinker at them are going to understand that, but obviously there's some that maybe don't. They just see what's going on and are like, crap, we need to do something about this, But what I was going to talk about is Ravi Zacharias. As much as it's hard because there's such a stain on his ministry, maybe a better one would be him or R.C. Sproul from Legionnaire. But these guys that are really prominent apologists are also really good storytellers and really good, you know what I mean? So when you're reading this, it's like, man, okay, this makes sense why these people were really well received. You know what I mean?
there's still a lot of guys like Turek and some other guys that go on the college campuses and have those open question answer
Yep.
times where you're
Yeah.
kind of confronting the inconsistencies
Yep.
that worldview, which I think is so cool.
Well, see, and I think that's why you're seeing, and this is what's hard. Again, this is why I think a guy like Ben Shapiro, and I would say even Steven Crowder, are really well received because they're pushing it back against it, but they're not Christians. And, well, Steven Crowder says he's a Christian, but it's hard to really know. I don't know. It's hard to know. He says he's a Christian, so.
But you're talking about having those spaces.
But he's having those spaces to think and to question, and is there objective reality? Is there truth? They're not wording these questions that way. Although Ben Shapiro probably is more than Steven Crowder. Steven Crowder is more handling like political and ideology type topics, whereas Ben Shapiro is handling those things, but he is handling them very philosophically, and scientifically. I mean, he's using reason and logic, but he's also using science, but I think that's why those guys are really popular, like really, really popular right now. Even in church-going people, you know what I mean? And they're doing some good things in that regard, but at the same time, again, this is the same discussion. I remember I had a discussion with Lindsay about this, Candace Owens in particular. And she said, my concern with Candace Owens isn't, and this is from Lindsay, my concern with Candace Owens isn't necessarily what she says, it's the fact that she's not a Christian. So she's not coming at these things from a Christian worldview. She's coming at them from a man-made worldview, which I don't think is much better, you know what I mean, than what the other side's trying to tell me, you know what I mean? And I think that's a really insightful observation, you know what I mean? Because that's the hard thing about this discussion is it's not subjected to one side or the other. You know what I'm saying? It's not, there's people that think exactly like this that vote conservative, and there's people that think just like this and vote liberal. You know what I mean? We use some liberal examples of this, but I guarantee you that we could talk about this with conservative ideology as well. So, and that's why, again, I think that line, yes, yet it must be born in the mind of that many believers understand little of the comprehensiveness of God's eternal plan for salvation, yet have credible profession of faith and are doubtlessly Christians. Right? We have to have a credible understanding of God's eternal plan, but also understand our limitations of that. But we have to be doubtlessly Christians. I think that's a really important thing. So, all right, let's wrap it up. Unless someone else has something else they want to say. I'm going to pray just to close this out since we're done. All right, dear Heavenly Father, come today. Thank you so much for this, man, just this semester, getting into some really interesting discussions. I know we have had some people join us online, and that's been fun. Lord, I just ask that as we continue to move forward, Lord, that there might be more room and more space to have discussions like this. I'm excited about what the future holds for it. Lord, help us to be doubtlessly Christian. Help us to follow Jesus wholeheartedly in a way that we can engage a postmodern world that, man, doesn't believe in your objective truth, doesn't believe in your absolute truth, Lord. Lord, I'm thankful for your scriptures. I'm thankful for what you've given us in the Bible and how we can use that to reach and engage a lost world. Help us to be salt and light. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. One interesting thing that Eric said, and he said this, he said he had a professor that in college said that postmodernism is trying to reach godly goals, talking about oppression and trying to reach some level of godly goals in a human way, and that of course will never lead to anything good.